really delighted to have our presenters today who are experts in employment law who will help us navigate the traps for the unwary as everyone tries to do the right thing with respect to DE&I initiatives in their firms. So with that, I'd like to welcome Liz Johnston and Emily Coombs, who will take us through today's presentation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks so much for attending our webinar today. My name is Liz Johnston, and I'm an attorney in the Labor and Employment Group at Verrill. And with me is my colleague, Emily Coombs, who is also an attorney in the Labor Employment Group at Verrill. Today, we're going to be talking about, as the title suggests, traps for the unwary in employer DE&I initiatives. And over the past many years, companies of all shapes, sizes, and types are focusing on increasing their diversity, equity, and inclusivity efforts and developing a more diverse workforce. But with that, there are legal risks associated with various initiatives that are being put into play. And we find that we're getting more and more questions from our clients about the risks associated with various initiatives and also how to mitigate those. And so we look forward to discussing some of those with you all today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, there is a copy of the slides that will be available through a link in the chat today, and it will also be available via email and online, I believe, after the presentation is concluded. And we will also be recording today's presentation, so you will have access to it later if you'd like to review it or share it. We also invite you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll work on getting those answered sort of as they come about or at the end of the presentation today. We also encourage you to drop any thoughts or comments that you have into the chat as well. There's also a raised hand feature. If you'd like to make a comment, we might wait until the end to answer those types of comments and questions via that feature, just so that we can make sure we get through all the material today. But we definitely invite you to participate in those ways. And to get us started today, I'd like to invite you all to take a brief poll about where your organization's current efforts and concerns are in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And if my moderator could pull up the poll there, that would be great. So I think our participants should be able to see that. But really, we just want to get a sense of where your organization is driving or prioritizing DE&I efforts. And I'll give everybody just a moment to take that poll if you wish. And Anne, I will leave it to you, my moderator, to flip to the results once we have those. All of the above. All right. Well, that is good news because we are going to be discussing legal issues related to DE&I efforts for recruiting, hiring, and advancement today. And to give a brief overview of what we'll be looking at, I will turn it over to Emily.
Great, thank you, Liz. If we can flip forward to the next slide, that would be great. Awesome. So as you can see here, and as Liz said, we are going to be covering 3 different trap areas, we're calling them, of recruiting, hiring, and employee advancement. So for recruiting, we are going to focus on all of the work that happens before you ever sit down and interview a candidate. So your strategy, voluntary affirmative action plans, and referral bonuses. Within hiring, we are going to spend some time talking about implicit bias and the impact that that has on candidate applications and interviews. And finally, within advancement, we are going to review performance monitoring and covering in the workplace and the impact that this can have on diversity initiatives. So with that, we will dive right into recruiting. So when we talk about recruiting strategies, there are a couple of things we're going to kind of talk through to get started. But I always feel kind of almost bad in a way to highlight recruiting as our first trap area, only because I'm sure many people have been involved in an organizational recruiting initiative on the phone. And it's usually a very exciting project. The organization is really ready to bring in some talent, and the initiatives are really important to the business. But this is an area that we need to focus on because there are many things that can potentially expose the organization to liability. So the first question here, who is included in your recruiting strategy, is our first trap, because I think this is something that comes up a lot in organizations. And to illustrate what this question is really asking, I'm going to provide an example that I think will be helpful to consider. So many organizations participate in early career or college hiring. And a lot of times in our conversations, we hear things like from the business, such as like, we're really excited to get some energy into our organization, or we really want to bring in some young blood. And I think this is a good example to point out because college hiring doesn't inherently mean that you're going to be getting candidates in the early 20s age range, right? It almost goes without saying, but a lot of people take different career paths to get to different places in their careers. And some people may be transitioning from a different career path within private industry. Others may have been in the military and went to school and now are participating in this college recruiting process. And so decisions based on assumptions can lead to age discrimination claims within this type of an example. So this is where it's kind of helpful and necessary for corporate counsel to intervene and check on those expectations and those assumptions that might be happening behind a recruiting strategy to ensure that that line of thinking doesn't come into play when making hiring decisions. A little while later in the presentation, we are going to talk about implicit bias, and I'd kind of encourage you to keep this example in the back of your mind when we get to that conversation as well, just because I think this could be helpful as an example. The second recruiting trap here is, where are jobs posted? So this is really a technical consideration that has to do with the accessibility of the job posting. And really the question here is your organization choosing publications that advertise job postings that may be eliminating groups of people from seeing the postings and being able to apply? And something to really ask here is, when you're going about posting jobs on different posting sites, do those posting sites attract a certain demographic? And to be clear, we're not saying, don't leverage technical publications if you're working in a very specific industry and there's a technical skill that you really need for that position. But I do think it's important to challenge the organization to think, if you are utilizing those types of sources, is it every job that needs to be involved in that type of a posting process? Because not all jobs might require that level of posting. And if it's a source that you need a subscription for, or that has other barriers to entry to see those jobs, it could be adding a barrier that's not necessary and hurting your applicant pool really at the end of the day. An example of that might be a little bit more easy to reach, just because not every employer is utilizing a specialty technical trade service or magazine, is something that was actually in the news recently. You may remember the Facebook class action lawsuit a few years ago now, where several companies had purchased job advertisements on Facebook, and Facebook kind of in the background had a coding system that was pushing those jobs to users under the age of 55. And there were other lawsuits at the time as well that alleged similar complaints, but in the areas of gender and religion. And it was all based on what people were sharing on their Facebook profiles. So it gets kind of tricky, because a lot of companies, will utilize outside posting services to make it easier. But really, at the end of the day, it's important to understand these technical platforms that are being used and understand the legal risks associated with some of the decisions that are being made by those vendors. Moving on to the third question, what is included in the job posting? I'm sure many of you have heard about over the last several years, there's been a lot of research on gender inclusive job postings, with many studies demonstrating that verbs from posting or getting qualified for, or feeling like they're qualified, excuse me, for certain opportunities. And so something like this is important to make note of. And really to avoid it, I don't think a lot of employers are really doing this anymore, but being cognizant about the words that we're choosing in job postings. So instead of he will work on XYZ in a posting, the successful candidate will work on XYZ, avoiding gender specific pronouns. And then also trying to choose words that are more descriptive in nature. So an example that's used quite a bit are words like hacker, rock star, superhero, things that I think are, maybe done to try to make the job seem more exciting, have been shown to be more masculine leaning. So kind of sticking to the more traditional engineer, project manager, those terms are more inclusive and have been shown to not create that disparity in applicants. And something I'd mention along with this potential trap area is that it's a huge area for technology. There are a lot of tools available now that actually search job requisitions for language that demonstrate these male-female characteristics and will provide you with suggestions. So that's something certainly to look into if that's something that feels like it would be helpful for your organization. And finally, we have word of mouth hiring. So this is, I'm sure we've all heard of this before, but just to make sure, it is what it sounds like. It's using current employees to solicit new employees. And I think this can feel like a really good idea for employers in the moment, just because you might have a great employee who does an amazing job and you're just like, oh my gosh, I want to take this person and clone them, and I want that to be my whole team. But the issue with that is, several issues. But what happens is if the employer relies too strongly on that type of a strategy, and there are no parameters, we're going to talk about referral bonuses here in a minute, but in a system that's not regimented or restricted in any way, if the employer has a workforce that is exclusively made up of a particular class or even predominantly made up of a particular class, using this type of a recruiting strategy really opens the door for someone to come in and say, the employer is trying to just perpetuate the current makeup of their workforce by using this word of mouth strategy. So really all of these questions and these talking points speak to the importance of having clear non-discriminatory practices and processes in your recruiting strategies. And if we move forward to the next slide, we're going to close out with some tips in addition to the ones that we've talked about. So I think the takeaway here with these tips is all of this is really just getting to the point that recruiting strategies are business strategies, and you should constantly be looking and evaluating and making sure that what you're doing makes sense for your business and for your diversity and inclusion goals. So consider the methods and the locations of job opening advertisements to ensure coverage across protected classes. We spoke about that. Request statistics from the services that you're using. Make sure that it's making sense with the candidates that you're getting, and ensure that protected classes are not excluded. And advertise job openings in a variety of media. I think sometimes we find services that work really well and we rely on them heavily, but it's important to make sure you're switching it up. And finally, consider whether the existing workforce is homogeneous and diversify those strategies to reach a broader audience. And having clear referral practices and policies and not making exceptions. And to that point, Liz is going to take us through referral bonuses because that's something that comes up very frequently within referral policies.
Yeah, so referral bonuses, related to what Emily was talking about with word of mouth hiring, referral bonuses are a very popular way, as I'm sure many of you use them in your organization, to cut out some of the time and cost and effort in attracting good talent. It's natural to want to use the existing talent and your high performers, the people that are doing great work for you, know your company, know your organization, and use their recommendations in their network to find other employees that will hopefully be as successful. And there are two types of referral bonuses that I want to talk about when we're talking about DE&I traps. And those are your general referral bonuses for referrals for any applicant to be recruited to the organization, as well as targeted bonuses, which we are seeing more and more of and getting more questions about, which are either increased referral bonuses or separate referral bonuses for persons of color or protected classes and candidates in those groups, and bringing them to the organization. So the issue with the general referral bonuses, as Emily was mentioned, if you have a very singular workforce where it's predominated by a certain group or a certain class, people tend to associate with people like themselves. Not always, not exclusively, but that's what we've seen, and what a lot of companies have seen is when they're utilizing these referral bonuses is that people have networks with the people that they grew up with, the people that live in their towns, the people that go to their religious institution, people with similar interests. So we're effectively casting a net in a very small pond that's very like the makeup of the organization as it already exists. And that might be reducing the likelihood that an organization is making jobs available or known to people outside of those networks. The other type of referral bonus, when we talk about a targeted bonus toward people in protected classes, in and of itself, those types of bonuses are not illegal or problematic per se from a legal point of view, in that it's not prohibited to have an increased bonus for a referral for a member of a protected class. The issue, though, becomes when we have a candidate network now where the referrals are for those protected traits, are playing a role in our hiring decisions. We need to consider still, of course, the objective factors for why somebody should be employed or why they're hired, and make sure that we're not making decisions based exclusively on characteristics like race or membership in another protected class, gender, sexual orientation, and things like that. And we see biases come into effect with referral bonuses that are sort of specific to this realm. And I've mentioned up there anchoring bias, halo bias, and framing bias. And we'll talk a little bit more about implicit bias later, but in the context of referral bonuses, it's escalated in the sense that in addition to having potential biases toward people based on our own implicit biases, there's additional risk of bias because of the person that a candidate is associated with when they're coming to the organization. So we have an anchoring bias where we know that Jane Doe referred a great candidate, and Jane Doe's our anchor there. And so we think very highly of Jane. And so then we tend to think more highly potentially of the candidate that she referred. A framing bias is also something to keep in mind. And I know in many of your role in corporate counsel, it might not be something that you are directly involved with during the hiring process, but it's important to keep these things in mind when you are reviewing decisions or reviewing hiring processes. But the framing bias can come into play when, in the sense that information might look different when it's packaged in a different way. So people might tend to think differently of a candidate based on the fact that they were referred by a specific person, rather than if they saw that information come in on an application. And it goes both ways, right? So we think differently potentially about the candidate that's actually being referred, and also potentially think differently about the candidate who only applied via an application. And these types of biases might prevent someone in HR, someone who's responsible for hiring, from making a non-biased and purely objective decision. You can go the next. Yeah.
So to provide everyone with an example of a D&I strategy that companies use in the face of these considerations, we want to talk about briefly the Rooney Rule, which is something that actually originated out of the NFL. So for those of you who haven't heard about this before, the rule is named after Dan Rooney, who was the former owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers and the former chairman of the NFL Diversity Committee. And the rule was created actually as a reaction to some events in 2002 where 2 African-American head coaches were terminated. And shortly after that event, U.S. civil rights attorneys came forward with a study that showed that African-American head coaches, despite winning a higher percentage of games, were less likely to be hired and more likely to be fired than their white counterparts. So employees in the NFL saw this survey and they got together and advocated for the creation of this rule. And the purpose behind the rule was to ensure that minority coaches would be considered for the high-level coaching positions. And the rule itself was that in an interview for a head coaching position, there had to be at least one underrepresented minority to be interviewed. And after the rule was implemented, there were impressive results. Minority head coaching hires in the NFL were increased from 6% to 22% in 2006. And a few years later, in 2009, the rule was expanded to other positions within the NFL. So from an HR perspective, implementing a program like this can be a great way to keep diversity top of mind in the interview process and ensure that you're looking at a diverse pool of applicants. And something I do want to make a distinction on here is that the rule focuses on those who are interviewed. It's not focusing on those who are hired, and it's not a hiring or a preference requirement. And that's important, as you all know, because you can't, it's illegal to decline to hire someone based on their race. So those same concerns aren't the same at the interviewing stage. So this is a way to really assess your candidate pipeline and see if you ensure that you have a diverse pipeline. And I think if companies were to implement this type of a rule and find that they aren't able to meet the criteria of the rule, whether that's interviewing 1 or 2 or however many minority underrepresented candidates, then that's a conversation that kind of takes us back to our discussion on recruiting strategies, right? Looking at where you're advertising, trying to understand, if you're seeing a diverse pipeline or if you're not. So that's just something we wanted to kind of share as a D&I initiative that has been successful in the NFL. And with that, we are going to turn to our next topic, which is voluntary affirmative action plans.
Yeah, and just to add on to your discussion, Emily, when you're talking about, evaluating the results of recruitment efforts, I mean, that's really the solution sort of that we want to offer for some of these considerations that we're bringing up, is taking that step back and looking at our recruitment efforts and where we're recruiting, who we're interviewing, and monitoring how people are making it through that pipeline of the hiring process. And evaluating that data and those metrics can give a better idea of where to go from there. And so we've talked about, how to expand our recruitment efforts. And as Emily mentioned, and I'm sure most of you watching hopefully know that the rule is that you cannot take into account protected characteristic when you're making hiring decisions. And this becomes difficult because when organizations have a very valid goal of increasing the diversity in the organization, it really raises the question of how to do it. And some of you might be part of organizations that have an affirmative action program, either through a government contract or in that context. But we're seeing organizations also develop voluntary affirmative action programs as part of the way to increase diversity in their organization. And these types of programs fall under a narrow exception to the general rule that you can't consider race or protected class when you are making hiring decisions. There are some important considerations, though, when you are thinking about taking that sort of initiative. And I'll talk about those in just a moment, but I really want to be clear that these criteria must be met for an organization that is considering engaging in sort of a voluntary affirmative action program where you want to increase the presence of a certain protected class in your management team or your board of directors by sort of a deliberate amount to deliberately hire people of that characteristic, rather than, as we've been talking about, taking broader recruitment approaches to widen that net. So when we're talking about voluntary affirmative action programs, the three requirements are, first, that the plan needs to be remedial in nature, meaning that there must be past discrimination or a possible adverse impact on the group that we're discussing. And this is difficult because I think some organizations might not realize that this does require the acknowledgement that there is an issue with this particular group, or that this group has been specifically identified as being subject to past discrimination or an adverse impact. And so if you do have a policy that is going to promote the hiring of a specific class, it's just important that that class be specifically identified and the policy be very carefully tailored to only address that, to get past the Title VII requirements not to prohibit equal employment opportunity. The next factor is that the plan must not unnecessarily interfere with the interest of non-minority employees, such as terminating those employees to replace them with more diverse employees. And what that means is, in a nutshell, if you have a voluntary affirmative action program that fits within these requirements, it can't require replacing white employees with non-white employees. There have been organizations in the past couple of years that have seen white men and white women giving up leadership positions and board seats, so that those can be replaced by minority seat holders. And that's okay, because that's not a termination or the organization asking those employees to step down in that regard, which would violate the requirements for a voluntary affirmative action plan. And the third requirement for one of these plans is that the plan must be temporary in nature and achieve balance without maintenance. So essentially, if your organization is considering a voluntary affirmative action program, it does need to have some time limit on it and be intended to be a temporary program with specific targets, rather than an open-ended goal to just hire more people of a specific characteristic without those parameters. Okay, so next we will talk about switching to interviewing and hiring. And we'll start out today by talking about implicit bias. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this concept, but for those of you that are less familiar, or just as a brief refresher, I want to talk about it a little bit because it is so important to understand, particularly in the interviewing and hiring context, and also when we're talking about maintaining the efficacy of our DE&I initiatives, going through advancement and maintaining our employees. So implicit bias is the unconscious association, either positive or negative, of a stereotype with a particular group. The stereotypes or the associations are not related in any way to the employee's objective performance or cognitive ability, intelligence, any objective factor really. And implicit bias is something that we all have, and it's unique to everybody. It's based on where we grew up, who we've been friends with, who we've associated with, what music we listened to, what schools we went to. And it doesn't live on the surface like explicit bias does. So that's, implicit bias in an individual context. The other type of bias I just want to mention briefly is systemic bias and organizational bias. And this type of bias relates to the essentially implicit biases of an organization or of the policy and procedures that have come into play for that organization. And it's not necessarily bias that's based on the biases of a particular individual or particular manager, but it's just the way that practices, processes, procedures have developed over time that have become implicitly biased towards certain groups of people. Just as an example of what systemic bias looks like, there was a case a few years back where there was an exam that firefighters had to take, and there was a behavioral component to the exam, as well as a written component to the exam. And the written test was weighted more heavily in the way that the exam was administered. And the results of the exam showed that white employees or white exam takers did far better on the written exam than Black test takers. And because of that, there was a really great disparity in how the exam results were coming out. So, that's not necessarily, well, I should say, having a written exam isn't necessarily a biased activity, right? And having that component be weighted a certain way is certainly not necessarily intended to be biased. But that's one way that, a practice or a policy or a procedure can become sort of implicitly biased in a systemic way for an organization. So next we'll talk about a few specific types of implicit bias. Again, when we're talking about these, they're obviously rooted in social science rather than a particular legal construct. But the reason that we talk about them in this context is because when we're talking about traps for the unwary and DE&I initiatives, when we look back at our efforts in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we wonder why our initiatives were successful or were not successful, or if we're faced with a claim of discrimination or harassment, despite all of our efforts here. Implicit bias is often one of those things that we might not realize is happening at the time, but comes into play and ends up playing out in a practical way in the decisions that are made, all the way from recruitment to hiring to advancement. So just to talk briefly about a few different types of bias, for example, one type of bias that we see quite a bit is confirmation bias. And this is a type of bias where we tend to listen to information that confirms what we already believe. So just as an example, if you attended a certain school and you have a bias and you think that people from that particular school tend to be better employees, then you might look for information that supports your decision or your belief that those students from that school are going to be great employees and weigh that more heavily against potential applicants from other colleges or universities. Another type of bias that we see is bandwagon bias. And this is a type of bias where it's more likely for somebody to believe something the more people that believe it. So we see this a lot in the workplace in terms of meetings, specifically when we're talking about recruiting and hiring. If there's a team that's responsible for making recruiting and hiring decisions, if you have a room full of people that are of a certain belief, then it can actually shape the beliefs of the other people that are in the room that might not necessarily have started with that. And the reason it's important is because, as with all bias, decisions need to be rooted in objectivity and objective data rather than implicit biases that can play out and add a subjective factor that might not necessarily be equitable. We can flip to the next one. So just a couple more of these that I want to mention. Outcome bias in particular. Again, when we're talking about interviewing and hiring in particular, outcome bias is something to keep in mind because outcome bias is essentially the type of bias that results from when you look only at the outcome to decide whether the decision was a good one. As the example that our little infographic here uses, which I know is probably difficult to see, but might show up better if you download the PowerPoint. The example is that if you win a lot of money in Las Vegas, it doesn't necessarily mean that the decision to gamble was a good one, right? So if somebody in the organization makes the decision based on for hiring or for advancement or something like that, just because it turns out okay in the end doesn't necessarily mean that the initial choice was the best choice or that the initial choice was made without bias. And selective perception is another type of bias I just want to mention briefly, which is where we allow expectations about how certain things, or our expectations about how things will turn out, affect the way we perceive the world around us. And so we can see this in the employment context, where we might expect certain behavior or activity from somebody based on a characteristic, and weigh that in a way that's not necessarily objective if we have other people operating the same manner, but we're not necessarily expecting it. So all of these come into play when we are trying to stay objective in decision making, and thus reducing the potential liability for a claim later on.
So next, we're going to talk about the application process as a trap within hiring. So the first element of this is application accessibility, and there are a few concerns that can kind of come up here. I think most organizations now utilize online applications. However, something to be mindful of here related to online applications is that some areas in the country don't have access to high-speed internet. Liz and I are both based in Maine, and here in Maine, there are some large rural communities that aren't able to access high-speed internet just because of the infrastructure in the area in which they live. So as a result, those communities are potentially excluded from certain types of applications, and employers that potentially are even within their local area if the process is exclusively online, or if they can't apply online, have to go through way more barriers than someone that can just log on at home. There's also, other concerns to be aware of, like language accessibility for applications. And in, the new normal, or the new now that we're living in, for employers that require, say, COVID-19 testing in the future for interviews or anything like that, if you're requiring candidates to get a COVID test before coming on site to interview, it could potentially impact certain communities adversely if tests are hard to come by, if someone has to, miss their work at their current job to go interview and get a COVID test to do that, or if they're not able to get to a testing center based on where they live. So I think here, the key takeaway is just to be mindful of the processes in place and the potential to exclude certain classes. And it might be, things that don't immediately come to mind. So it requires a little bit of extra analysis. In the same area, as it relates to application, there are some other developments that I think are important to be mindful of. Ban the box laws are becoming more popular. So removing the box indicating if an applicant has a prior criminal history, and the laws are really continuing to evolve. I have some examples here in Massachusetts pertaining to different tests that can't be used as a condition of employment, like HIV antibody or antigen tests, or genetic information, which is another area that seems to be becoming more and more of a hot topic as the years go by. So just some stuff to be mindful of here in the applications that are available to candidates. If we flip to the next slide, another area within this subtopic is interviews. So considering the points that Liz made about implicit bias earlier, it's important to note that when we schedule interviews for our organizations, managers, HR, other interviewers, whoever's in that room is coming in with their own biases. And for this reason, it's important to prepare interviewers with appropriate interview questions. So I think we could all come up with a list of things that are not okay to ask in an interview. So excluding those things that we could think of or brainstorm, I wanted to kind of focus on questions, topic areas that, I think might come up in a conversation because you have an interviewer who wants to feel like they're connecting to the interviewee. Maybe they're being, trying to be friendly, and it's just not, they're crossing a line and they might not even realize it. And I think that comes down to, preparing interviewers and making sure they understand what's okay, what's not okay. But, even if they have that impulse and they want to make a connection with the interviewee because they think they're going to be spending a lot of time with them if they come on board as a full-time employee or a part-time employee or what have you, they have to fight that impulse to make sure that the process is fair to all candidates. So here are a couple of examples that could potentially have implications for protected classes and expose organizations to liability. So, dates of school attendance, that could get to somebody's age. The last name of the applicant's father and mother, that could get to national origin. The one thing I did include in here that I did want to point out is down the bottom, do ask applicants about the need for reasonable accommodations when scheduling an interview. That's something that's okay to ask. Maybe it doesn't come from the manager. Maybe you have a recruiting process where that question comes up before an interview ever takes place. And that should be applicable in the world of virtual interviews and the world of in-person interviews, just to make sure everyone is able to participate at the same level with whatever they need. I did also want to make a note that sometimes we get the question, well, it's not our interviewers that are asking these things. We walk them through, a lot of preparation. They know what they can talk about, what they can't talk about. But sometimes you have an interviewee who wants to kind of dive into some of these topic areas or questions. And, I think that kind of gets into the preparation too, is to prepare interviewers to recognize that even if they're not initiating the conversations, that these subject areas just aren't relevant to an interview. And they can kind of practice, politely pivoting the conversation. Even something as simple as, if an interviewee gets to talking about something that's not related, thank you, I'd love to go back to XYZ, or I'd love to move forward to this new topic. Just to help direct the conversation. I think sometimes interviewers get nervous, like they don't want to do the wrong thing, and it's a way to just kind of keep it going and move on to what you need to assess the candidate against the objective criteria that's associated with the job. If we could flip forward to the next slide, please. So just some tips to kind of leave you with. Ensure that only those individuals whose qualifications are best matched to the written job requirements are selected for interviews. So I think this really gets to implicit bias too, because to Liz's point about schools, it might be a manager flipping through applications like, oh, I went there, like, I'm sure they're a great candidate, and trying to be really strict and sticking to the qualifications and making sure that everyone you're interviewing meets those. Consider documenting the risks for selection or non-selection to minimize the risk of discrimination claims. I think that also kind of helps keep people accountable and articulating reasons instead of making gut decisions, and ties them back to those objective criteria. And finally, I personally think this one is a good recommendation, using multiple decision makers or a committee, and then you get multiple opinions and you're kind of checking each other's biases and making those decisions. So just some things to consider. And now we are going to move on to our next topic area of advancement. So the first area, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's all you.
Okay, thanks. So the next area is monitoring performance and performance reviews. So, I think I would think about this area like I would think about interviews, right? So you are interviewing candidates, the candidates come on board, they're selected, now they're employees. Just because they're now employees, it doesn't mean that, implicit bias in managers has gone away. It's still something that needs to be checked. And again, objective goals and measures comes in, and you need to make sure that you're holding employees accountable to those and not to any other standards that might come out. The term culture fit comes out a lot, and it's something that we wanted to kind of call out because, it can be a very challenging phrase and sometimes can be used to engage implicit bias. So that's just a term that I would kind of challenge to understand, what do you mean by not a culture fit? Like what are the tangible things that lead to that? Because it could end up being something that implicates a protected class. And finally, when it comes to performance, emphasizing honest feedback and opportunity to improve is just so important. And especially with like performance reviews, formalized performance reviews, which I know a lot of companies aren't, really, many companies have moved away from an official performance review. But we see a lot of performance reviews come through that, perhaps the employer is saying, oh, there's an issue here, and the performance review is very positive. And so it kind of makes you wonder, does the employee know? Like, have there been conversations? Are there misunderstandings that are happening between the employer and the employee? It raises a lot of questions and potentially sets you up for a harder time later on if those performance reviews aren't clean in terms of what they're containing and aren't made to look better than the employer's experience, I guess. Liz, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that section before we move on to covering.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And, going back to culture fit, and Emily mentioned that can potentially implicate, protected status, protected class. Like, I think that's really important to think about in the context of sort of general feedback and commentary we're using. If somebody gets a performance review that said that they're not assertive, or they're not nice, or they're not likable, things like that. If that type of feedback is given to one gender of employee, I think it's just important to keep in mind whether we're using those same standards to apply to another gender of employee, because certain terms can implicate certain groups of people, and if we're not applying them equally and holding people to those same standards, then that can potentially be discriminatory if there's adverse action taken on that basis. All right, so one of the last topics we want to cover today, not the last one, but one of them, is covering. And so when we're talking about DE&I in the context of advancement, covering can be a concept that's really helpful to understanding some of the issues that can arise in this area. So covering, for those of you who haven't heard about it, is when a person attempts to minimize personality characteristics or personal attributes based on the societal stigma or stereotype associated with those types of attributes. And so when we're talking about traps related to DE&I, I don't want to insinuate that this is anything purposeful or malicious or deceitful on behalf of anybody that's engaging in covering. It's not necessarily purposeful, but people engage in covering to sort of subtly downplay things about themselves for the fear of making others uncomfortable, or the fear of other people making assumptions about them, or having attention drawn to them based on that characteristic. Sometimes it's not purposeful at all, and it's just something that happens as a result of trying to fit in the workplace. And so although this isn't sort of on its face, it doesn't on its face seem like a legal issue per se, it can be a trap, so to speak, in the sense that if we have a group of employees who are engaging in covering, who aren't being themselves or don't feel comfortable being themselves at work, then we need to consider how that balances with the expectation that we expect employees and managers to make reports of things like sexual harassment, of discriminatory behavior at work, of unfair treatment. How does their comfort level and them feeling like they're themselves, or like that they can be themselves at work, how does that play into whether they're going to report protected activity or illegal things or unsafe conditions at work? And as we know, when we're facing claims, and as counsel, when you're dealing with complaints down the road, not getting that report is really important and can really affect how that claim is handled and how the result of that claim in the long run. So for that reason, we just wanted to discuss this issue a little bit. So the statistic on the screen, 61%, that is drawn from what's called the Deloitte study. And it's a study done by Deloitte University. It's a leadership study, and they really discussed covering in detail, and I'll talk about the 4 different types. But that was the result, was that they found 61% of employees engaged in covering, and those statistics get much, much higher when we're looking at women, women of color, Black employees, LGBT employees, and even heterosexual white males. I believe it was 45% had said that they engaged in covering at some point. So it's obviously an issue that is happening in the workplace. And there are 4 different types that the study had identified. That's appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and associational. So appearance-based covering is when individuals present themselves differently, or it relates to how they present themselves to others. It can be related to any protected characteristic, from race to sexual orientation to military status. And it's how people try to hide or mask a certain aspect of themselves to better blend in or fit in. And sort of a historical example of this, because this is something that's not necessarily a new phenomenon, or that just came out or is a new thing. But if we think about FDR, sort of hiding his disability or wanting to be photographed in a way that minimized his use of a wheelchair, then that's a classic example of covering from a historical figure. Another type of covering could be related to actual traits. In the Deloitte study, one respondent indicated that she covered by wearing more masculine clothes and modeling male behavior, going to places that men liked to be better part of the group that she was in. Another type of covering is called affiliation covering. And this relates to how individuals avoid behavior that's standard for their group. In the context of working mothers who avoid talking about their childcare responsibilities for fear of seeming less committed to work. Another type is advocacy covering, and this is the degree to which people stick up for each other or other members of their group in the workplace. And this one's particularly relevant to potential hostile work environment claims or discrimination claims, because it's covering in the sense that people won't make a comment if they see gender bias going on, or they won't stand up and say something if they feel that there are jokes being made about members of their organization. And obviously that's problematic if people aren't stopping the behavior and making reports about the behavior that can result in a claim later. Lastly, associational covering. This relates to people covering the people that they want to associate with. So we see this here for women who are afraid to sponsor other women because they're afraid of being put in that group and stereotyped as only working with women. People who have medical conditions, not associating with certain groups or certain individuals because they don't want to have that attention drawn to their medical status. So those are some examples, and I know we're running close to the end, so we have a poll question, and I'd love to invite everybody just to sort of, as we're wrapping up, take a moment and reflect on whether you've personally engaged in covering of one of these types, or if you know somebody that's engaged in covering. Because in addition to being aware of it, having a sense of how prominent it is and recognizing that it does occur in leadership and in everybody potentially is one of the first steps in sort of creating a more accepting and inclusive workforce. And so we'll keep going with the next slide, but definitely feel free to take that poll.
Yeah, so as you guys, start to kind of engage in that poll, I think, Liz, to your point, looking at some of these statistics here on this slide from the Deloitte study, it's pretty clear that a lot of people have engaged in covering at work. And, I think what's concerning about this is that people feel like they intrinsically have to hide who they intrinsically are, based on the fear that there are going to be ramifications in their career if they are themselves, which is certainly concerning for an organization. And it is relevant to diversity and inclusion initiatives, because when people are covering up their true selves and not being authentic, it's really pretty much impossible to create an environment where everyone is included. So for that reason, it's so important to make sure that managers know about this concept and are looking for it, so that they can understand if it's happening in the organization, and if so, where is it, why is it, and kind of get to the bottom of that, why the covering is happening, to make sure that initiatives can be ultimately successful.
So we'll go to our last slide here, talking about affinity groups and other initiatives to build inclusivity, and some of the legal issues that are associated with those. But while we're on the topic of covering, think about also how covering it might influence people's willingness to engage in different affinity groups or initiatives to build awareness or community or support around individuals with specific issues or specific classes. So that might be one of the hindrances that a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative faces, is a unwillingness or a reserved approach to participate by employees if they are engaged in covering. And Anne, if you have results for that poll and you want to pull them up, that would be great. But just a few, as we're getting into our last little bit here, looks like from our respondents, 56% of you said that you've engaged in covering or known someone who's covered at work, 16% no, and 28% not sure. So that's pretty consistent with the Deloitte study. But just to wrap up here, when we're talking about affinity groups and other initiatives, the key thing to keep in mind here is treating employees equally, right? So when we're having events or working on engaging our employees, making sure that we're doing things that are inclusive of people of all genders and family responsibilities, disability statuses, and different protected classes, to make sure that our initiatives aren't unknowingly excluding people. For example, if there's a certain group of people at your organization who always go out to the bar on Thursday nights, and that's a big social time and team building activity, somebody with parenting responsibilities at night might not be able to attend. Somebody who has a mental or physical health disability might not be able to attend, and somebody who has alcoholism might not be able to attend. So that while it's not necessarily inherently problematic to have events like that, what happens when that group of people who are going out start giving that other person a hard time? Or what happens when they start talking business when they're out, and it's disadvantaging the person who's not able to go because they're part of a protected group or a group that can't attend. So looking at the activity and the outcome of the activity is really critical to mitigating risk. And with affinity groups in particular, just making sure that groups are receiving the same treatment, equal treatment, and that includes things like funding, access to leadership and company resources, and things like that, so that certain groups aren't being disadvantaged over others. So I know I'm out of time, and Robin wanted to give a few closing remarks here, but of course, if there are any other questions or follow-up, definitely please reach out to us via email, and we'll hang out here for a couple minutes as well.
Emily, Liz, thank you so much. That was quite informative. I know I learned a lot from your presentation today. So on behalf of the ACC and everyone who's participated in today's seminar, thank you very much. We appreciate it. For all of you who've enjoyed this presentation, I would love for you to know that we're going to work with Verrill again on June 7th to do a program that will focus on LGBTQ trends in